Hello, beautiful people.
And welcome to the third installment, the third video in the Elemental Reaction Guide. This video is going to focus on a bit more in-depth interactions with Dendro-related reactions. We're not going to go all the way into all the complicated stuff. That's going to be kept for the fourth video. But we are going to be basically explaining how they work and the ways that you can use them to build teams. First off, we have Burning. I decided to start with Burning because Burning is kind of not that great. It was actually nerfed. Before 3.0, Burning used to apply a lot more pyro to enemies, and the nerf was inside of the more complex mechanics with elemental gauge and all that, but the part that you really need to know is just that it's not nearly as good as it used to be, and it's a lot harder to keep pyro on enemies with Burning. Before 3.0, I was excited about the possibility of using Burning to keep a pyro aura on enemies and trigger a lot of melts on them, but with the nerf, it's still doable, but it's a lot worse than it would have been. So let's get into what Burning actually does. So it is somewhat similar to Electrocharge in the sense that when the enemies are burning, there is more than one aura on them. They have a pyro aura and they have a dendro aura. But as long as you have burning on an enemy, it's gonna keep burning and it's gonna keep doing damage. The pyro is gonna basically stay the same, and then the dendro is gonna get rapidly consumed by the burning. And once you're out of dendro, your burning stops. Now, the duration of the burning is basically decided by however much dendro you have. So the more dendro you have, the longer it'll last. But as a general rule, it really doesn't last all that long. So if you want to keep an enemy burning, you need to reapply dendro relatively often. A really good way to visualize this is that it's kind of like adding wood to a fire. You keep your fire burning, and in order to keep it going, you have to constantly keep adding wood over and over. Burning damage isn't really bad, but it's also really nothing special, and because it lasts such a short amount of time, you need to apply a lot of dendro to actually keep it going consistently. So as a general rule, because of the nerf that was given to Burning in the 3.0 version, Burning is really not that great, and I would generally try to stay away from Burning for team building. And if you really want to build a team around Burning, you can use it to keep a pyro aura on enemies to reverse melt, but you're generally just going to be better off using an off-field pyro applicator like Chainlink. Next up, we have Bloom. Bloom is arguably the least straightforward reaction out of all the reactions we have in terms of how it actually functions, how it actually works. So, a lot like Crystallize, when you trigger Bloom, it doesn't do anything to the enemies, it's just going to generate an entity on the ground, and it's going to generate a seed, unlike a crystal for Crystallize. But unlike Crystallize, you don't pick up the seed, you have a few options in terms of things you can do with a seed. The first option is to not touch it, right? You don't do anything to it, and if you don't do anything to it, then either after 6 seconds, which is the time limit, or if you generate so many seeds that you start having more than 5, because there's also a limit of 5 at once, then the seed is going to explode. When it explodes, it deals damage. Bloom, unlike any of the reactions we've seen so far, can actually damage your character when you trigger it on an enemy, but it's only going to deal 5% of the damage it deals to enemies. You're taking 20 times reduced damage from the blooms you trigger. That being said, that's not the only thing you can do with blooms. That's the first choice that you have, is to just let them expire and explode. The other choice that you have is to hit them with either pyro or electro attacks. And hitting those seeds with either pyro or electro is going to trigger a sub-reaction, respectively Burgeon and Hyperbloom. All three of those reactions, so Bloom, Hyperbloom, and Burgeon, they deal dendro damage, which means that you can easily increase their damage with the Deepwood Memories artifact set, and you don't have to worry about doing specific setups for swirls because, well, you can't swirl dendro. One thing that's a bit different between Bloom and its sub-reactions and other transformative reactions, because Bloom is a transformative reaction, is that it shares a property with multiplicative reactions. And that property is that it has a strong side and it has a weak side. Now, the strong side and the weak side, the forward and the reverse, in the case of Bloom, don't affect the damage whatsoever. The multipliers, the formula will be the exact same whether you're triggering forward or reverse Bloom. But what does matter is the amount of aura that you're taking away from an enemy. So the forward side is Dendro on Hydro, which means that whenever you apply Dendro on an enemy that has a Hydro aura, it's effectively always going to remove all of the Hydro. Whereas the reverse side is Hydro on Dendro, and when you apply Hydro on Dendro, you don't actually always remove all of the aura. Because of this, it's generally going to be a lot easier to trigger multiple reverse blooms with a Hydro trigger than forward blooms with a Dendro trigger, because you don't need as much Dendro and you can still trigger multiple reactions per Dendro. But in 3.0, the Dendro units that we have access to have generally pretty slow Dendro applications. Tichnari has good, fast Dendro applications, but only for a relatively short time frame and mainly in single target, whereas both Kole and Dendro MC have AoE application, which is nice, but it's relatively slow. Because of that, you still have to be careful not to apply a large amount of Hydro in order to keep triggering your reverse blooms. We also have a few other potential issues with Bloom. Namely, it's going to take a while for the Bloom seeds to expire if you choose to let them explode by themselves, and enemies can just move away or get knocked back, which would mean that they can actually just dodge your Bloom even if you triggered it on them. So in order to circumvent that, you can use an Animo unit to keep the enemies grouped, or you can use Cryo units to freeze them together. Another property that Bloom obviously shares with transformative reactions is that the only stats it looks at are your level and your elemental mastery, which means that if you want to maximize Bloom damage, all you need, all you really want to do, all you really care about is triggering as many blooms as possible. That being said, that doesn't mean you just want to apply as much Hydro and Dendro as you can, because if you do that, then it's possible that you end up with different units being the ones to trigger Bloom, which would mean that you have to build all of those different units with elemental mastery and none of them for talent damage. Whereas the ideal scenario would be that one of them triggers all of the blooms and the other units are built for their talent damage. That said though, both the issue of the seeds taking a while to explode and the issue of it being difficult to make sure that it's always the same unit triggering Bloom can actually be avoided by using the sub-reactions for Bloom instead of Bloom itself. Now, before we move on to the sub-reactions, we need to talk about Quicken, because there are going to be some of the sub-reactions that interact with Quicken. So Quicken is the Electro and Dendro reaction, and it's effectively just a reaction that buffs your Electro and Dendro damage. A good way to think about it is that it's a little bit like putting Freeze and the Blizzard Trigger set together to just make a reaction. But instead of getting the enemy to be frozen, they're just quickened, and the quicken status effect doesn't actually do anything. Now, the reason I'm comparing it to Freeze instead of Superconduct is because just like in Freeze, where you gain a Freeze aura on an enemy when you trigger Freeze, when you trigger Quicken, the enemy gets a Quicken aura. Unlike Freeze, the Quicken aura doesn't actually do anything by itself, but just like Freeze, it gives you access to sub-reactions. So whereas in Freeze you can use Shatter, in Quicken you can use either Aggravate, if you apply Electro to a quickened enemy, or you can use Spread if you apply Dendro. Spread and Aggravate are effectively the same reaction. They work the exact same way, but obviously because Aggravate is triggered by an Electro character, it deals Electro damage, and Spread deals Dendro damage. But we'll get into the specifics of Aggravate and Spread in a minute. What I want to talk about right now is the Quicken aura itself. When you apply Electro or Dendro, when you trigger Aggravate or Spread onto an enemy that's quickened, it doesn't actually remove the Quicken aura. It doesn't even weaken it, it just leaves it there. It's as if you didn't do anything. Which means that as long as the enemy's quickened, you can apply as much Electro and Dendro as you want and still keep getting the sub-reactions. But the Quicken aura functions like a Dendro aura when it comes to other elements. Which means that if you apply Hydro to the Quicken aura, then it's going to trigger Bloom and it's going to remove part of your aura. And if you apply Pyro to the Quicken aura, then it can actually burn it off. Which means that in teams where you start mixing up a little bit the Dendro reactions and the elements, you have to be careful not to apply too much of the other elements if you want to be able to maintain your Quicken. Because once you start applying too much Hydro or too much Pyro, you can actually replace your Quicken aura with another aura, and then you won't be able to trigger Aggravate and Spread anymore. We'll be covering exactly how you can combine reactions when we get to the Hyperbloom and the Burgeon section, But for now, let's just really cover what Aggravate and Spread actually do. So Aggravate is the electro sub-reaction for Quicken, like we said, and when you trigger it, the attack that triggers Aggravate gets its damage increased by an amount that's based on your level in Elemental Mastery. But that damage increase happens before your attack takes into account damage percent and before it takes into account crit, which means that effectively you can get an Aggravate to crit, and you can get an Aggravate to be increased by an emblem set or something like that. So effectively, your Aggravate is scaling with your level, with your Elemental Mastery, with your damage percent, and with your crit. Because character levels are generally really cheap, then when you're using a unit in Aggravate teams, and they are going to be triggering a lot of Aggravates, you have a pretty good incentive to level up your character all the way up to 90. That being said, it can be a little bit confusing to know which stats you want when it comes to Aggravate. So the main thing to keep in mind is that Elemental Mastery will only be affecting your Aggravate damage, whereas damage percent and crit will be affecting both your Aggravate damage and your base talent damage. If you trigger Aggravate with Kutsing's normal attack, you'll have the Aggravate damage, but you'll also have the normal attack damage. And both damage percent and crit can increase both of those things, whereas EM only increases the Aggravate part. So as a general rule, you want to focus on damage percent and on crit more than on Elemental Mastery, but Elemental Mastery is still pretty useful. The faster your electro application is, the more you like EM, and the higher your talent levels are, the more you like attack. But you'll generally be trying to go for a mix of both. Because it basically just adds to the number, then obviously Aggravate is doing electro damage, whereas Spread deals Dendro damage. It works the same way. The only main difference is that Dendro characters generally have access to less external buffs because Dendro is a more recent element and we don't have as many characters with synergy in their kit with Dendro, nor do we have as many weapons and things like that. So the way that they decided to balance it is instead of releasing a bunch of changes to characters, they just decided to make the Spread damage a little bit higher. It effectively kind of just balances out though. On top of that, in 3.0, the units we have aren't actually all that great with Spread. Technari can actually be pretty good with Spread, but he's effectively only single target. So while he is pretty good with Spread, I wouldn't say that any of Technari's teams are particularly meta breaking or anything like that. One of the most important things about Aggravate and Spread is that you can actually have the Quicken aura coexist with another aura. So when you apply Electro and Quicken, you'll trigger Aggravate, yes, but you'll also be applying Electro to the enemy, which means then the enemy is going to have both Quicken and Electro on them. Or if you apply Dendro, they can have both Quicken and Dendro on them. The reason why this is really relevant is because since you can have Electro and Dendro on them, that actually lets you attack that enemy with Anemo. Because Anemo doesn't react with Dendro, you'll actually be able to swirl Electro on a quickened enemy if they have Electro on them. You'll also be able to have sets like the Thunder Soother set give their damage bonus when the enemy has an underlying Electro with their Quicken aura. Because Aggravate is an additive reaction, then attack buffs, they affect your talent damage, but they don't affect your Aggravate damage. Which means that in Aggravate teams, units like Bennett that give a massive attack buff aren't actually quite as valuable as they usually are. Whereas units like Kazuha or Jean or Sucrose that can trigger Viridescent Venemer actually are just as valuable as usual because reducing enemies' electro resistance affects both your talent damage and your Aggravate damage. Because of this, you'll have Anemo playing a pretty important role in most Aggravate teams. Now, if you were to focus on the Spread aspect of a team, you wouldn't be as reliant on an Anemo unit because Anemo units can't swirl Dendro. But as of 3.0, I wouldn't say that we have any Dendro carries that are really good enough to justify building a Spread team around your Dendro unit's damage only. However, that doesn't mean you shouldn't build around Spread at all. Because the nature of Quicken is that when you apply Electro and Dendro on them, it doesn't remove the Quicken. Which means it's not just that you can apply as much Electro as you want, you can apply also as much Dendro as you want, and both at the same time if you want. Which means that, well, you're gonna need a Dendro unit to trigger Quicken, and if that Dendro unit has fast Dendro application, then they can also trigger a bunch of Spread. So when it comes to choosing which units you want to put in a Quicken team, there's generally two things that you want to look at. You want to be looking at how much damage percent and crit a unit can get through external buffs, something like Stringless, something like like the catch passive, those things are incredibly valuable. But also, you want to be looking at how fast a unit can apply their element. The faster your elemental application, the more aggravates you'll get, and therefore the more damage you'll get. And if you manage to find a unit that has a good balance of external buffs and fast, for example, electro application, then they'll probably be pretty solid in Quicken teams. There's one more use for Aggravate that I haven't actually covered here, which is triggering chain reaction aggravates with Animo unit by swirling electro. We're going to be really covering that mostly in the 4th video, but I'm letting you guys know that it is possible. It is possible to aggravate with an electro swirl. Let's get back to the Bloom sub-reactions, because I said that understanding how Quicken works is important to really understand how you can use the Bloom reactions. It's not too important for Burgeon, but it will be more important for Hyperbloom. We're going to start with Burgeon, get it out of the way, and then we'll focus on Hyperbloom as the last part of the video, because I would argue that Hyperbloom is probably the reaction that has the more depth out of the DENDRO reactions, and the one that has the most options in terms of what you can do with it. So, like we said earlier, applying Pyro to a Bloom seed is going to trigger Burgeon. Burgeon basically is the same thing as letting the seeds explode, but it deals 50% more damage. The main reason that you might want to use Burgeon is because it lets you avoid the 2 issues that we talked about when it comes to Bloom. Because you can trigger it whenever you want just by applying Pyro, you don't have to hope that the enemies stay in place long enough for your seeds to explode. And because you can only trigger it with Pyro, you don't have to worry about who's getting your Elemental Mastery between your DENDRO and your Hydro character, because it's neither of them. It's going to be your Pyro character that wants the Elemental Mastery, because they're the one that are triggering Burgeon. That being said though, those upsides of being able to avoid the issues with Bloom do come at a cost. And that cost is that, well, you might actually trigger Burning. Obviously, if you want to trigger Burgeon, you need to have DENDRO and Hydro to trigger Bloom, and then Pyro to trigger Burgeon. But that means you have DENDRO and Pyro. And if you accidentally trigger Burning, it can actually kind of screw you over in terms of getting your reactions. Because then when you apply Hydro to Burning, you don't actually get a Bloom. In order to get a Bloom, you would need to apply a large amount of Hydro. So either Hydro twice or an attack that applies a lot of Hydro, but we'll be covering that in the 4th video. Now what this means is when you're playing Burgeon, it will be a lot more difficult to be using the reverse Bloom sides. Because in order to reverse Bloom and therefore get more seeds, like we explained in the Bloom section, you need to apply Hydro and DENDRO, which means the enemy needs to have a DENDRO aura. But if the enemy has a DENDRO aura, when you apply Pyro to them, well, that starts burning, and that fucks you over. Which means that you effectively are left with 2 main options. Your first choice is to stick to a Pyro unit that doesn't actually apply that much Pyro. So what I mean by applying too much Pyro in this case is, it's a concept we're going to be exploring more in the next video, but a little bit of an introduction to it is that elemental attacks don't always apply the element. Sometimes they'll still have the pyro colored number, but it won't actually apply pyro and it won't be able to trigger a reaction. So if you use characters that are like that have attacks that don't apply the element, then they won't trigger burning on those attacks. However, the way that it works is basically with an internal cooldown, where your first attack will trigger the reaction, and then some attacks won't, and then it'll start again, and then it won't, over and over again. But this cooldown is specific to each enemy, which means that the seeds themselves, well, the first time you hit them, they explode. So it's always the first time you hit them, which means that even if you're applying pyro slow, as long as you're hitting with pyro, even if it's a pyro attack that does not apply pyro, you can still trigger Burgeon. The other option that you can go for is to use a hydro unit that has incredibly high hydro application. If you do that, it will reduce the amount of blooms you can trigger because you'll be forced to do forward side blooms instead of reverse side blooms, but you'll always have a hydro aura on the enemy. Either a hydro aura or no aura at all. But because you have a hydro aura, you can actually combine it with that pyro unit and let that pyro unit actually trigger Vaporize on top of triggering Burgeon. So, all of this to say, the two main ways in which you can use Burgeon is either slow pyro with a unit like Toma, or fast pyro with incredibly fast hydro with a combination like Child and Xiangling. One thing that's important to realize about Burgeon and also about Bloom is that because they have an AoE to their attacks, and what happens if you're triggering two of them at once? Well, if you're triggering two Burgeons at once, the enemies that are in range are each gonna take 2 instances of Burgeon. But if you're fighting two enemies, you apply Dendro and then you apply Hydro, and one Bloom reaction while it's hitting two enemies, you're triggering Bloom on 2 different enemies, so you will generate 2 seeds. And then those 2 seeds can both explode at the same time, which means that you can effectively get more value out of your Bloom things and your Burgeon things when you're in AoE. That being being said, it does have a hard limit of 2 instances of damage per 0.5 seconds, which means that if you have 5 seeds on the ground and you make them explode all at the same time, enemies will only take 2 instances of damage each, unfortunately. Another property that Burgeon shares with Bloom is the ability to damage your character and not just enemies, which means that in most teams where you focus on Burgeon, you are going to be needing a dedicated healer in order to not die to your own reactions. Now that we have Burgeon out of the way, let's move to basically the final boss of DENDRO reactions, which is Hyperbloom. The baseline reaction of Hyperbloom is pretty simple. It's just like Burgeon in the sense that when you apply Electro to a seed, you trigger Hyperbloom, and when you trigger Hyperbloom, instead of it just exploding in AoE, it becomes a projectile that seeks out an enemy and that deals effectively single target damage to them. Technically, it's not actually single target, it deals an AoE, but the AoE is so small that it's almost always going to be single target. And while it can technically also damage your own character, you have to be so close to an enemy for that to actually work that it's effectively just never going to happen. The reason why Hyperbloom is a bit more complex than the other reactions is because Electro has a property that lets it coexist with a few different things. Electro can coexist with Hydro and Electro Charge. When you trigger Electro Charge, you'll have both Electro and Hydro on the enemy. And similarly, once you've triggered Quicken with Electro and Dendro, if you reapply Electro, Electro can coexist with Quicken. Then the question becomes, what happens when you apply Dendro to Electro Charge? And what happens when you apply Hydro to an enemy that has Quicken and Electro on them? And that's why Hyperbloom is a little bit more complicated than the other reactions. When you apply Dendro to an enemy that has Electro Charge on them, you'll trigger Bloom from the Hydro, and then you'll trigger Quicken from the Electro. But because of the way that Quicken works, when you trigger Quicken, it puts a Quicken aura on the enemy. Which means that effectively, you're able to use the Electro aura that is on the enemy to double the amount of Blooms that you get. When you apply Dendro on Electro, you get your Quicken aura that also behaves like a Dendro aura. And then you can hit that with Hydro to get another Bloom. Which means that you get a Bloom from applying Dendro and Electro Charge, and then if you reapply Hydro, you get another Bloom from Hydro and Quicken. So you effectively are going to be getting one forward side Bloom and one reverse side Bloom, both with the same Dendro application. Because of the Dendro units we have in 3.0 generally struggle with getting fast Dendro application, especially in AoE, this is actually incredibly relevant in terms of maximizing the amount of Blooms you can trigger. Also, because of the interaction that Electro has with Quicken, if you reapply Electro before you reapply your Hydro, then what that does is that puts the Electro back on the enemy for you to be able to reapply Hydro to them and do the same thing again. Which means that effectively, your Electro in Hyperbloom is helping you to get more seeds, it's helping you to get more Blooms, which is the exact opposite of the way that it works in Burgeon. In Burgeon, when you apply Pyro to a Dendro aura, it just fucks over your reactions. But in Hyperbloom, when you apply Electro to your Dendro aura, it actually helps you. Because of this, in Hyperbloom teams, you're basically always looking for units that have relatively fast Electro application. There's almost never a downside to having more Electro. That being said though, this is not the only thing that you can do with Hyperbloom. This is the way that you can get the most amount of Hyperblooms, and that's definitely one direction you can take. However, it's not the only direction you can take. Like I talked about in the Quicken section, Quicken is effectively treated like a Dendro aura, which means that if your Hydro application is not particularly quick, if you've got relatively slow Hydro application, and you can re-trigger Quicken in between all of your Hydro applications, then you'll actually manage to keep Quicken on the enemy, because Hydro on Dendro, and in the same way Hydro on Quicken, is a reverse side reaction, so it won't completely wipe it, it will just shorten its duration. If you apply Hydro twice, it's going to remove it, but one time, generally, it won't. Which means that as long as your Electro application and your Dendro application aren't too slow, and as long as your Hydro application is slower than those Electro and Dendro applications, then you'll be able to get Blooms, and also get Hyperblooms, obviously, without actually losing any Quicken uptime. Which means you can use your Quicken teams, you can use an Aggravate team, with a slow application Hydro unit. In short, you have two effective ways of using Hyperbloom, and both of those ways actually rely on some of the Quicken properties. The first way is to use the Quicken aura to effectively double your Blooms, so you trigger Bloom with Hydro, but then because it's on Electro Charge, you also trigger Quicken, and then you can get another Bloom out of your Dendro application. Or, you go for slow Hydro application, and you keep Quicken uptime. Which means that the two directions you can have is basically a pure Hyperbloom team, where you don't bother with Quicken, you keep a lot of Hydro application in there, so that you can just get as many Hyperblooms as possible, which also lets you go go for some of the very good Hydro units we have that just deal a lot of damage, for example, Singto and Yalan. Or you can go for a unit with slow Hydro application, a unit like Kokomi, like Mona, like Barbara, who can effectively apply enough Hydro to get a few blooms still, without actually stealing uptime on your Quicken. And this way of playing Hyperbloom, because you're combining Hyperbloom and Quicken, is generally something that's going to be referred to in the rest of this video and the next video as Quick Bloom. Quicken and Hyperbloom together. But that about does it for the DENDRO reactions. A little bit of a summary is that burning is not all that great. There's gonna be some niche uses for it, but all in all, it doesn't do too much. Bloom and teams that focus only on blooms and not their sub-reactions can struggle with making sure that the enemies don't dodge the seeds and making sure that you always have the same trigger. Quicken teams basically just want as much Electro and Dendro as possible, with characters that ideally also have a bunch of damage percent and crit buffs. And then for Burgeon and Hyperbloom, for each of those teams, you basically have two main ways of playing them. So for Burgeon, you can go slow Pyro with reverse blooms, Dendro Aura, Hydro Trigger. Or you can go fast Pyro with forward blooms with a Hydro Aura that stays on the enemy basically all the time because you apply it so quickly, like with something like Child. And then finally for Hyperbloom, you can either go balls deep on the Hyperbloom stuff, you can go fast Hydro and fast Electro, and that lets you trigger as many Hyperblooms as possible, basically 2 Hyperblooms per Dendro application. Or you can calm down a little bit on the Hydro application in order to keep Quicken uptime and get your Electro unit to deal even more damage. But that basically does it for the third installment of the reaction guide. I hope you learned a thing or two. If I realize after releasing this video that I've made a mistake, I will most definitely be correcting myself in a pinned comment. If I find new ways of using the reactions, I'll do that as well. For this video, the stuff I've covered is still mostly simple. I haven't covered every single way of using the reactions. I haven't talked about ways that you can combine Burgeon and Hyperbloom, and I haven't talked about ways that you can use Cryo to get more blooms, but that will be kept for the last video because it's a bit more complicated stuff. I hope you'll be looking forward to that video. I appreciate you all watching the guide. Bye, YouTube.